Hello, I would like to, in this video, discuss the subject of nationalism, and I want to discuss it from two contexts, as I understand it. Nationalism as a concept is something that I am somewhat wary of, and it is particularly from one of these contexts I am wary of it. So I'm going to speak a bit about the two contexts as I see it, why I'm wary of it, and some examples. And also how I differentiate nationalism and patriotism. Now, I may have covered similar themes in other videos. That is something that is characteristic of my channel, but so be it. That is because sometimes I'm thinking of a particular subject at a particular time, and I may be covering it from an angle that I didn't previously cover. So that's the reason. So nationalism. Like I say, I see it from two contexts, and I divide it into what I would call revolutionary nationalism, and then there is reactionary nationalism. Now, revolutionary nationalism, I would align with independence movements. Um, this is basically, as we saw throughout the 20th century, in the decolonization process, the great European powers, when their empires disintegrated, especially with Britain and France, there were various independence movements which then saw the creation of many new countries throughout the mid 20th century, let's say between about the late 1940s and early 1980s, broadly speaking. Um, Now that is what that's what I would describe as revolutionary nationalism, because all of those movements, they were based on anti-colonialism, but they were also based on a sense of national identity. Um, and historians in those countries, I think, would generally define it that way, as being about national identity, i.e., that an outside force has occupied the land, and it's time for us to reclaim this as our own and forge a national identity. Some examples are in Indonesia, in India, throughout Africa. Well, there's many examples, in fact. Um, So that's what I would call revolutionary nationalism. And it's very much human nature. It's very understandable. Self determination, I believe, is part of human nature. Um, and incidentally, I don't want to make this sort of complex in and out video about the rights or wrongs, especially wrongs, of empire and imperialism. That's for another video. I do have views on that, but for another video. Um, so that's what I would describe as revolutionary nationalism. Throughout the world today, there is still those sort of movements going on. There is, of course, the Palestinian movement. There's the Kurdish movement. Um, there's a West Papua movement. There's various movements for peoples who feel that they need a nation state, and these are long and often bloody and complex problems and struggles. But I think it can all come under the sort of banner of nationalism. So that is what I would describe as revolutionary nationalism. Another example closer to home is the Republic of Ireland, which has just celebrated, or commemorated is maybe a better term, the 1916 Easter Rising, the centenary of the Easter Rising, which of course began the process of the Republic of Ireland at least becoming an independent country. That was followed by the War of Independence and then the Irish Civil War. Um, so that's the first type of nationalism. Now, the second type of nationalism is something that I want to focus a bit more on, and that is what I would call reactionary nationalism. That is a nationalism that can be found in countries that are already long established. So it's not a case of a country trying to shackle off a foreign power or protect itself from genuine invasion, but a reactionary nationalism based on perceptions of historic wrongs, perceptions of threat, whether real or unreal, or basically scaremongering. Now, again, there's historic precedents to this. Some examples are two prominent examples, in fact, are Germany and Italy. In the early 20th century, there was, of course, Mussolini's black shirts in Italy, and in the case of Germany, of course, the rise of Hitler's Third Reich. Um, Now, these were both in countries that were already established, granted, established in the 19th century as unified states, but nevertheless, they were established countries. So these were not independence movements, they were not sort of struggles against a colonialist oppressor. They were movements in countries that were already established. And in more recent years, there has been, I can think of at least three prominent examples. There are many others, but I can quote four. In Russia, in China, in Europe, and in America. And I'll mention each of those briefly. Um, in China, it was very, very prominent during the 2008 Beijing Olympics when you had no one died, but there was some very ugly scenes of confrontation between those who were pro Beijing and those who were anti Beijing. There was Tibet protesters, there was human rights protesters. On the other hand, you had very nationalistic, especially overseas students protesting in favor of China. So that's one example with that. I might come back to that in a minute because it's one that I've given a lot of thought to. In Russia, there has been examples of neo-nationalism in recent years, especially directed against NATO and around Russia's involvement in wars in the Caucasus and in Ukraine, and especially, in my view, fostered by President Putin. In China, incidentally, it could be argued that President Xi has fostered a very nationalistic, um, let's say, agenda. In Europe, this sort of reactionary nationalism is still much more on the fringe, but it has become very prominent, especially in the last year and a half or so, against the influx of refugees. It's been seen in Germany, it's been seen in parts of Western Europe, especially against the threat from Islamism, which is a very real threat. This is not something that's a conjecture or an imagination, it's very real. Um, so that is a reactionary nationalism. Now, I just want to clarify at this point when I say reactionary, I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what it is. It is a reaction to a threat, whether real or perceived. I'm not passing judgment as to whether it is right or wrong. That's for debate. But that's what it is. It's a reaction. In North America, it's been very prominent in the last year, especially on the Republican side of the presidential campaign. Needs to say, I don't even need to name Donald J. Trump. I just have. Um, that's nationalism. So this phenomenon can be seen all over the world, east and west. Now, why am I wary of it? I am wary of nationalism because, in my opinion, it blinds people to reason. Now, to be clear about this, I'm politically a centrist. I'm not a left winger. So when I say that reactionary nationalism is sometimes understandable, when a country has experienced a major terrorist attack, it's completely natural that people would feel angry and defensive. I think it would be pretty strange if they didn't. When there has been a trend of crimes that may have been committed by foreign nationals, again, some of the sentiments against that are understandable. When there's a clash of values and there's a reaction to that, that is understandable. But the reason I'm wary of this sort of nationalism when it really takes hold is that it can really, really blind people to any sense of reason because it becomes extremely tribal and it kind of it blinds people to a point where you're either with us or against us, and anyone expressing any sort of dissenting view, no matter how mild that dissenting view may be, is automatically seen as a traitor. Going back to the Chinese example, I remember during that whole fiasco with the Beijing thing, there was a student at Duke University in the United States, a Chinese student. Now, what she done was she tried to basically, there was a confrontation between the two protesting sides on the university campus. I remember reading about this story and being quite troubled by it. She wanted to act as a mediator. She wasn't taking the side of the anti China protesters, but she was simply trying to basically tell everyone to calm down. Because of this, the Chinese nationalists decided to threaten her and her family. Her family were threatened back in China. I remember being very angry about that and feeling this was an incredibly obnoxious way to present love of nation, especially in another country. Now, to me, that is one of the most obnoxious forms of nationalism to demonstrate it when you're in another country. And I feel that in Western countries, we have seen this in recent years where, because we're multicultural societies, and because we value freedom of expression and peaceful freedom of assembly, Western countries have sort of become like a playground for parts of the world where either nationalism is extremely high or there is political or ethnic conflict going on for those sentiments to kind of be brought out in Western countries. Um, I've made videos about the situation in Thailand, and there has been very raw examples of basically threats happening in London. I don't need to go into details about this, but I've made reference to it in another video. And let's just say that extremists have decided to take their political agenda to the extremes in London, in another country. During the Beijing torch relay, I do remember then there was controversy over these guys in blue suits, whose officially their job was to protect the torch, but there was quite a lot of resentment in the UK that they were sort of basically throwing their weight around and not letting the British police do their job. This caused a lot of resentment because it was in London. It was, and I know there's similar feelings in Paris and other cities. Now, I feel that the rise of China as a country, and I'm just using this as an example because it's quite prominent. Frankly, if there is xenophobia out there, it is not helped by the behavior of some overseas Chinese who are way too nationalistic, in my opinion. Now, there is a fundamental human nature to all of this, and that is that nobody, if they're being honest, likes to hear their country overtly criticized or attacked. No, no one likes to hear that. And I think most people, if they're being honest, would have some sort of reaction to that. However, the problem with nationalism is it gets people into a point where they're blinded into thinking that any critique must be wrong and any critique must be challenged. Doesn't matter if the critique is absolutely true. So the reactionary mindset of a Chinese nationalist would be if an outsider speaks, for example, about an issue to do with human rights, their mindset would automatically be this person is attacking China, I must attack them. And this is on one hand a very tribal thinking, but the interesting thing is it often comes from educated people. We're not talking here about ignorant peasants, because they haven't had access to education. We're talking in many cases about otherwise intelligent people, cultured people who have traveled. And to be fair, I don't want to give the impression I'm only giving some examples. This is truly a global phenomenon. You get intelligent Westerners who sometimes get very nationalistic as a response to perceptions of threats. So this is something that can be seen all over the world. I recall reading a poll recently that said that the majority of Indians would describe themselves as nationalists. That to me was quite interesting. Nationalists, not patriots, nationalists. Now, why do I differentiate between nationalist and patriot? In my line of thinking, patriotic is loving one's country and having a great affinity for one's country, but being objective enough to accept that one's country is not perfect and outside criticism is valid. Now, the nationalistic mindset is constantly being on the defensive, constantly feeling the need to defend. Now, I'm not going to lie, myself have probably been, if I'm being completely honest, quasi nationalistic at times. I've heard the United Kingdom criticised, and I have defended my country's reputation. And yet, I have also made many videos critical of things going on here. So there is something about hearing outsiders critique a country that most people just don't like to hear. And that's something that is very, it's a bit like, I would make this analogy. It's a bit like I can criticize the black sheep of my family, but if you're outside my family, oh, that's my family, so I'm still going to defend them, even if they irritate me, even if I don't like them, even if my, irritating uncle or irritating whatever it is, even if I don't like them personally, they're still my family, they're still my blood, so I'm going to defend them. Nationalism's a bit like that. Nationalists will talk about issues in their country, but it's almost like this exclusive right to do that. And if an outsider does it, that's taboo. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. But it does make me uneasy because it can descend into outright mob mentality. I don't want to exaggerate, this doesn't happen all the time. But when it gets to the point where basically anything goes in terms of defending a reputation of one's country, including threatening behavior, including mob violence, especially when it's displayed in other countries. That to me is something that makes me very uneasy. And I'll wrap this up here. Um, I've tried to give a lot of examples. I've tried to be as pluralistic as possible in the examples that I'm giving because I do believe this is an international phenomenon. The only thing I would say is in Europe, nationalism is very obvious now, but it is still on the fringes. So people who are overtly nationalistic are still seen as far right, quote unquote far right. This mentality is very obvious, but they're still seen as on the fringe. Whereas in many parts of Asia, needless to say, East Asia, it's very apparent. And I would argue in the United States with the rise of Donald Trump, which has now gone mainstream, that nationalism has become socially acceptable. I do feel that neo nationalism across the world has become more pronounced in the last 10 years than in, let's say, the 1990s. It has become something that can be seen as more volatile. So I'm not saying that the world's on the brink of something really major with this, but if you look at, for example, East Asia, apparently in the 1970s, 70% of Chinese had a good perception of Japan. Now it's only 12%. Now, I don't know how accurate that poll is, but if that's true, that is a really glaring example of just how pronounced nationalism in East Asia is. And a quick personal reference to that. I remember walking through a market in a touristic Chinese town. They were actually selling t shirts depicting the Japanese as devils. Now, that's obviously to do with wartime issues, but this would be unthinkable in Europe. You wouldn't go into a street in the UK and see Germans depicted as devils. And this is not a statement of moral superiority. It's just a reflection on something that is still very much apparent. Um, the situation between China and Japan is a very glaring example of nationalism, and I guess between Pakistan and India is another very glaring example. But like I say, it can be seen all over the world. The reaction in Europe to the refugee crisis it is increasing. So there's many examples to be found. Anyway, I've spoken at length here. I think it's a very, very important subject. Speaking personally, a final reflection. I love my country, but I always, always try to be objective and honest about the shortcomings of my country. And I would never want a situation where outsiders feel physically threatened. Um, it's just about empathy. I've been a traveler. I know what it's like. And in the end of the day, this is a sort of sentimental thing to say, but in the end of the day, we are all human beings, and national boundaries, whilst highly significant, there are certain human sentiments that really are universal. A nationalistic influence on that can sometimes blind people. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching.